of psychology, my favorite science. Psychology looks in one direction to biology, to neuroscience, to genetics, to evolution, and it looks in another direction to the rest of intellectual and cultural life, because what are the arts but products of the human mind that resonate to our aesthetic and emotional faculties? What are social issues, but ways in which humans try to coordinate their behavior with one another and come to working arrangements that benefit everyone. So there's no aspect of life that I don't think cannot be illuminated by a better understanding of psychology. And for me, the most recent example of that is the process of writing itself. I'm a psychologist who studies language, a psycholinguist, and I'm also someone who uses language to try to convey ideas in writing books about, among other things, the science of language, but also on war and peace and history and emotion and cognition and human nature. So the question that I'm currently obsessed with is, how does our scientific understanding of language actually be put into practice to improve the way that we communicate anything, including science? That is, can you use linguistics, cognitive science, psycholinguistics to come up with a better style manual? I've tried to write such a manual myself as a kind of 21st century alternative to the classic manuals like Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. Writing is inherently a psychological topic. It's a way that one mind can cause ideas to happen in another mind. The medium by which we share ideas, complex ideas, namely language, is something that's been studied intensively for more than half a century. And so if all of that work is of any use whatsoever, it ought to be of use in crafting more stylish and transparent prose. That's what I've tried to do. And coming to it from a scientific perspective, my starting point is different from that of traditional manuals, which are often lists of do's and don'ts that are presented mechanically and often followed robotically. One of the reasons that I was inspired to write this is that I had an inept copy editor for one of my pieces of writing who was clearly following guidelines from style manuals unthinkingly, not really understanding what their point was. An example is, everyone knows that scientists overuse the passive voice. That's one of the signatures of academies. That is, the experiment was performed instead of I performed the experiment. Now, if you follow the guideline, change every passive sentence into an active sentence, you actually don't improve prose, because there's no way that the passive construction would have survived in the English language for millennia if it didn't serve some purpose. The problem with any construction like the passive voice isn't that people use it, but they use it too much or in the wrong circumstances. In order to give good advice on how to write, you have to understand what the passive can accomplish, and therefore you should not blue pencil every passive sentence into an active one, as one of my copy editors once did. So what I try to do is to explain what the rules ought to accomplish, and therefore how to think about whether to apply them. And this includes the aspect of writing that gets the most attention, but is probably least important to good writing, and that is rules of correct usage. Can you split an infinitive? Can you say to boldly go where no man has gone before, or should you say to go boldly? Can you use the so-called fused participle? I approve of Sheila taking the job, as opposed to I approve of Sheila's taking the job, apostrophe S. And I discuss 100 of these traditional usage issues, but I put them late in the book because I don't think they're what we should concentrate on when we think about how to improve writing. The first thing you have to think about is the very stance that you as a writer take in putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard. The problem with writing is it's cognitively unnatural. In ordinary conversation, we've got another person across from us on the table. We can monitor the other person's facial expressions. Do they furrow their brow? Do they widen their eyes? Do they break in and interrupt you? Unless you're addressing a stranger, you know their background, you know whether they're an adult or a child, whether they're an expert in your field or not. When you're writing, you have none of those advantages. You're casting your bread onto the waters, and you are hoping that this invisible, unknowable audience will catch your drift. So the first thing you have to do in writing, well before you start worrying about split infinitives, is what kind of situation are you imagining yourself in? What are you simulating when you write and you're pretending to use language in the ordinary way? And that's the starting point, and I suggest that one of the things that distinguishes good, clear, vigorous writing from the kind of mush you see in academies and medicalese and bureaucraties and corporaties and so on is that stance. And the main stance is an idea that I got from literary scholars Mark Turner and Francis Noel Thomas, is that the model should be a combination of vision and conversation. Namely, when you write, you are pretending that you, the writer, see something that's interesting in the world. You are directing the attention of your reader to that thing in the world, and you do so by conversation. That may sound kind of obvious, but it's amazing how many of the bad habits of academies and legalese and so on come from flouting that model, from being self-conscious that you are not naive about the pitfalls of your own enterprise, about being a bad lawyer or a bad scientist or a bad academic, and so bad writing tends to get cluttered with apologies and hedges and somewhats and reviews of the past activity of people like you, as opposed to concentrating on something in the world that you are trying to get someone else to see with their own eyes. That's a starting point. Another aspect of writing is being an intensive reader. One of the things that you appreciate when you do linguistics is that a language is a combination of some neat, elegant, beautiful, powerful algorithmic rules for combining words in such a way that the meaning of the combination can be deduced from the meanings of the words and the way they're arranged. So if I say that the dog bit the man or the man bit the dog, you have two different images because of the way that those are ordered by the rules of English grammar. That's okay. On the other hand, language has a massive amount of irregularity, idiosyncrasies, idioms, figures of speech that you couldn't possibly deduce from rules, because often they are totally illogical. The past tense of bring is brought, but the past tense of ring is rang, and the past tense of blink is blinked. There isn't any rule that could allow you to predict that. You just have to have sheer raw exposure to language. Rules of punctuation, a lot of them are completely illogical. If I talk about Pat's dog, it's Pat apostrophe S. If I talk about its hat, I can't use it apostrophe S. That would be illiterate. Why? Who knows? That's just the way English works. It's arbitrary. So being a good writer depends not just on mastering the rules of combination, but of being exposed to tens or hundreds of thousands of examples of language on the printed page. And the first step to being a good writer is to be a good reader, to have read a lot and to savor and try to reverse engineer good prose when you find it. To read a passage of writing and think, how did the writer achieve that effect? What was their trick? And to read with a little bit of consciousness of what about that sentence makes it so much fun to skip through. Yeah, inevitably, what I'm doing in the sense of style is going to be compared to Strunk and White's The Elements of Style, a book that I have read many times, appreciate. It's a lovely little book. It's got a lot of insights, got a lot of charm. But William Strunk, the original author, was born in 1869. This is a man who was born before the invention of the telephone, let alone the computer and the internet and the smartphone. And his sense of style was honed in the later decades of the 19th century. Now we know that language changes. You and I don't speak the way people did in Shakespeare's era or in Chaucer's era. And as valuable as the elements of style is, and it's tremendously valuable, it's got a lot of cockamamie advice in it that was just dated by the fact that its authors were born more than 100 years ago, such as never use contact as a verb. Don't say, I'm going to contact him. They said this is pretentious jargon and pompous and self-important, which is kind of a bizarre reaction to anyone speaking today. It's an indispensable word. They said, well, be specific. Say you're going to telephone someone, or you're going to write them, or you're going to knock on their door. But the thing is that often it's extremely useful to be able to talk about getting in touch with someone else when you don't care by what medium they're going to do it. So contact is has become an indispensable word. It was jargon in their time, but if you read the elements of style today, you have no way of appreciating that what grated on the ears of someone born in 1869 might be completely unexceptionable today. The other problem is that it was, as wonderful a book as it is, it was composed before there existed a serious science of language and of cognition. And so a lot of their advice just depended on their own gut feelings of what grated on their ears, their own practice as an English professor or a critic, respectively. Now we can offer, I think, deeper advice. We can say why the passive voice, which, by the way, Strunk and White couldn't even identify, not being trained in grammar. We can say what a passive is and why it's sometimes useful. Another thing you have to deal with when you talk about writing from the point of view of linguistics and psycholinguistics is this pseudo-controversy that was ginned up about 50 years ago between so-called prescriptivists and descriptivists. Now, according to this fairy tale, there are prescriptivists who talk about how language ought to be used, and there are descriptivists, mainly academic linguists, who describe how language, in fact, is used. And that there is a war between them, that there are prescriptivist dictionaries and descriptivist dictionaries, and inevitably the sense of style is going to be called descriptivist, which is wrong on the face of it because it's 300 pages in which I'm bossing people around, so it's certainly prescriptive. But what it does is it questions a number of rules that you'll find in certain style books that are routinely flouted by all the best writers and had no business being in the style books in the first place. They don't make any sense. They violate the logic of English, and they just get passed down as a kind of folklore from one style sheet to the next. This pseudo-controversy was created when Webster's Third International Dictionary was published in the early 1960s. It was, like all dictionaries, it paid attention to the way the language changes. If a dictionary didn't do that, it would be useless. People would be guaranteed to be misunderstood when they wrote. For example, there is a prescriptive rule that says that nauseous, which most people use to mean nauseated, cannot mean that. It must mean creating nausea, nauseating. You can say the roller coaster was nauseous, or that movie was nauseous, not I got nauseous riding on the roller coaster. No one actually obeys this. And if a dictionary were to stick by its guns and say it's an error to say that the movie made me nauseous, it would be a useless dictionary. It wouldn't be doing what a dictionary has to do. And this has always been true of dictionaries. But there's a myth that dictionaries are kind of like the rule book of Major League Baseball. They legislate what is correct, which is just false. And I can speak with some authority there because I'm the chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary. And so I have which is dictionary that is allegedly the prescriptivist alternative to the descriptivist Webster's. But at American Heritage, people decide what goes into the dictionary by paying attention to the way people use language. Now, of course, it doesn't pay attention to the way everyone uses language, because people use language in different ways. When you write, you're writing for a virtual audience of well-read, literate fellow readers, and those are the people that we consult in deciding what goes into the dictionary, often with usage notes that comment on controversies of usage so that people will know what to anticipate. Now, this entire approach is sometimes criticized by literary writers who are often ignorant of the way that language works and fantasize about some golden age in which dictionaries legislate usage. But language is a grassroots, bottom-up phenomenon, always has been. And I think that the prescriptivist, descriptivist controversy is kind of like, America, love it or leave it, or nature versus nurture, a euphonious dichotomy that doesn't really help you think. There's a lot of people who get incensed about so-called errors of grammar, which are actually perfectly unexceptionable. There was a controversy in the 1960s over the advertising slogan, Winston tastes good like a cigarette should. The critics said it should be as a cigarette should. And everyone moaned about the decline of standards, the decline of civilization, or a more recent example was an SAT question. Toni Morrison's genius allowed her to write novels that spoke to the African American condition. And supposedly that's a grammatical error, that you can't have Toni Morrison's be an antecedent to the pronoun she. Now, it's a complete urban legend that this is an error of grammar. But once a rumor about a grammatical error gets legs, it will proliferate like an urban legend about alligators in the sewers, and often critics and self-appointed guardians of the language will claim that language is deteriorating because people violate a rule which was never a rule in the first place. It's just so much fun to be in high dudgeon over the decline of language and civilization that these critics don't stop to actually go to the rule books or the dictionaries to find out how great writers write and to find out the logic of the English language. Yes, so poets and novelists often have a much better feel for the language than the self-appointed guardians and pop grammarians, because for them language is a medium. It's a way of conveying ideas and moods and sounds, and the most gifted writers of Virginia Woolf and H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw and Melville and so on. Oh, well, and of course, avant-garde writers will deliberately flout rules, and poets pushing the envelope or expanding the expressive possibilities of the language will deliberately flout rules, including genuine rules that most people obey. But even non-avant-garde writers, even writers in the canon, will often write in ways that would be condemned as grammatical errors by many of the so-called purist sticklers and mavens. Another bit of psychology that can make anyone a better writer is to be aware of a phenomenon called the curse of knowledge. It actually goes by many names, and many psychologists have rediscovered it. Failure of a theory of mind, egocentrism, false consensus. These are all versions of an infirmity that we all have, every member of our species, which is it's very hard to imagine what it's like not to know something that you do know. And we see it in kids, their famous experiments. Kid comes into a room, opens a box of candy, there are pencils inside, kid's surprised, and then you say, well, now Jason's going to come into the room. What does he think is in the box? And the kid will say pencils. Jason has no way of knowing that the box has pencils, but the kid is projecting his own state of knowledge onto other people, forgetting that other people don't know what he knows. Now, we laugh at the kids, but it's true of all of us. We, as writers, often use technical terms, abbreviations, assumptions about typical experimental methods, assumptions about what questions are we ask in our own science that our readers have no way of knowing because they haven't been through the same training that we have. So overcoming the curse of knowledge, I consider to be the single most important requirement in becoming a clear writer. And contrary to the common accusation that academic writing is bad because people are trying to bamboozle their audience with highfalutin gobbledygook, I don't think that a lot of bad prose is deliberate. I think it is inept. It is a failure to get inside the head of your reader. And we also know from psychology that simply trying harder to get inside the head of your reader is not the way to do it. Because no matter how hard we try, we're okay, but we're not great at anticipating another person's state of knowledge. You really have to ask. You got to show people a draft. It doesn't even have to be a layperson. It can be even a colleague. And I'm often astonished at things that I think are obvious that turn out to be not so obvious when other people give me their feedback. Another implication of the curse of knowledge is that having an editor is a really good thing. There are some writers who can dash off a perfectly comprehensible, clear, coherent essay without getting prior feedback from a typical reader, but most of us don't have that much clairvoyance. We really need someone to say, I don't understand this, what the hell are you talking about? To say nothing of the attention to the fine points of punctuation, grammar, sentence structure, and so on that a sophisticated copy editor can add in creating value of your written work. For me, this topic is fascinating for two completely different reasons. One of them is that what I do for a living is study language as a language scientist, but the other thing that I do is I use language as a science writer. And reflecting on the thousands of decisions I make as a writer in the lifelong effort to improve my prose, and what I know coming from the other direction as a language scientist, actually studying the process of comprehension and the history of words and the logic of grammar, and often its illogic. It's been tremendously stimulating to bring these two together, to think, oh, the reason that I rewrote this sentence that way is because of the logic of subject versus object relative clauses in English grammar, and to think of an experiment on how people understand relative clauses of different kinds and think, oh yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing when I'm touching up my prose and switching a subject relative into an object relative. And I think for me, this is emblematic of what I hope to be an even larger trend in the application of science, particularly psychology and cognitive science, namely that there's no aspect of human communication or cultural creation that I think can't benefit from greater application of psychology. I think that we would have an exciting addition to literary criticism in general if literary critics knew more about linguistics, if poetry analysts knew more about phonology, sound structure, about the work on the psychology of the comprehension of metaphor, of the analysis of plot, could benefit from a greater understanding of human social conflicts and confluences of ultimate interests, that the whole genre of biography would be deepened by an understanding of the nature of human memory, particularly autobiographical memory. How much of our own memory of our childhood is real or confabulated? Memory scientists have a lot to say about that. How much do we try to polish our image of ourselves in both describing ourselves and even recollecting on our own histories? Do we edit our memories in an Orwellian manner to make ourselves more coherent in retrospect? How does a writer use the tense system of English to convey a sense of immediacy or distance? In music, I think that the sciences of auditory and speech perception have much to contribute to how musicians accomplish their effects. In the visual arts, an old body of criticism going back to Gombrich and Arnheim in collaboration with Richard Gregory, or even before that, the art itself of the 1920s was influenced by psychology, thanks to Gertrude Stein, who was an undergraduate student of William James, did a wonderful thesis on divided attention with William James, went to Paris, and she brought a lot of psychology, including the psychology of perception, to the attention of artists like Picasso and Braque, and ultimately this spread to Paul Klee and others. We've kind of lost that wonderful synergy between the science of visual perception and the creation of visual art. Going beyond the arts, I think that the social sciences, such as political science, could benefit from a greater understanding of human moral and social instincts, of our psychology of dominance, the psychology of revenge and forgiveness, the psychology of gratitude and social competition. All of them have great relevance to the international negotiations. We talk about one country being friendly to another or allying or competing, but countries don't have feelings. It's the elites and leaders who do, and a lot of international politics is driven by the psychology of its leaders, which a whole domain of application that's only beginning to be explored. And even beyond applying the findings of psychology and cognitive science and social and affective neuroscience and so on, there's just a mindset of science that I think ought to be exported to cultural and intellectual life as a whole. That consists in increased skepticism and scrutiny about factual conventional wisdom. How much of what you think is true really is true if you go to the numbers. For me, this has been a particular issue in analyzing violence, where the conventional wisdom is that we're living in extraordinarily violent times. But if you, first of all, take into account the psychology of risk perception as pioneered by Daniel Kahneman and Paul Slovic and Gerd Gigerenzer and many others, you realize that the conventional wisdom is going to be systematically distorted by the source of our information about the world, namely the news. News is about stuff that happens. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. Human risk perception is affected by memorable examples, Tversky and Kahneman's availability heuristic. And so no matter what the rate of violence is objectively, there are always enough examples to fill the news. And if our perception is influenced by memorable examples, we'll always think that we're living in violent times. And it's only when you start to apply the scientific mindset to world events, to political science and history, and say, well, how about someone counting how many people are killed now as opposed to 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, that you get an accurate picture about the state of the world and the direction that it's going, and which I've argued is largely downward. A conclusion that only came from applying this empirical mindset to the traditional subject matter of history and political science. The other aspect of the scientific mindset that ought to be exported to the rest of intellectual life is the search for explanations. That is, not to just say that history is one damn thing after another, that stuff happens and there's nothing that we can do to explain why, but to relate phenomena to somewhat more basic phenomena, and then to try to explain those phenomena into still more basic phenomena. What we've seen happen in sciences where biological phenomena were explained in part at the level of molecules, which were explained at the level of chemistry, which were explained at the level of physics. There's no reason that can't continue, so that biology gives us a grasp of the brain and the human nature that is a product of the organization of the brain, that societies unfold as they do because you've got brains interacting with other brains and negotiating arrangements to coordinate their behavior, and so on. Now, there's a tremendous resistance to this idea because it's confused with a boogeyman called reductionism. The idea that someone's going to try to explain World War I in terms of genes or elementary particles. And the thing is that explanation does not imply reduction. You reduce the building blocks of an explanation to more complex phenomena one level down, but you don't discard the explanation of the phenomenon itself. So World War I obviously is not going to be explained in terms of neuroscience. On the other hand, World War I could be explained in terms of the emotions of fear and dominance and prestige among leaders, which fell into a deadly combination at that moment in history. And instead of just saying, well, that's the way things are and there's nothing more we can say about it, we can say, well, why do people compete for prestige? Why do people have the fears that they do, in particular world leaders at this time? It doesn't have to be because I said so or because that's the way it is. You can say, well, how does the psychology of fear work? How does the psychology of dominance work? How does the psychology of coalitions work? Having done that, you get a deeper understanding of some of the causes of World War I. But it doesn't mean you throw out the history of World War I. It just means that you enrich it, you diversify it, you deepen it. And this, I think, program of unifying the arts and humanities with the psychological sciences and ultimately the biological sciences just promises tremendous increases in depth of understanding for all the fields. It's not about individual people. It actually has to be more revolutionary than that, than just reading this, that, or the other person. I think there really has to be a change in mindset. Coming from both directions. It's not just a question of getting traditional scholars in the humanities and social scientists to start incorporating more science, thinking more like scientists, but it's got to work the other direction as well. A lot of scientists really are Philistines when it comes to history and political theory and philosophy. And I think we need to just break down the idea that there are these separate disciplines and modes of study. In trying to figure out what would give us the deepest, most insightful, most informative understanding of the world and ourselves, one has to be aware of the turf battles in who gets the franchise for talking about what matters. And there is a cadre of traditional intellectuals who have often been hostile to science. I'm not talking about the climate deniers or the vaccine kooks, but who resent the idea that the discussion of what matters, of morality, of politics, of meaning, of purpose, should be taken on by these Philistines called scientists or social scientists. That this is kind of the franchise that is given to critics and literary scholars and religion. But I don't think that we should give any particular credence to people who are protecting their turf. It's becoming increasingly clear over the decades and centuries that an understanding of science is absolutely central to our understanding of all the deepest questions of who we are, where we came from, what matters. That if you aren't aware of what science has to say about who we are, what we're like as a species, then you're really going to be missing a lot of insight about human life. And the fact that it upsets certain traditional bastions of commentary shouldn't count, shouldn't matter. People will always protect their turf and their franchise. What matters is the ideas. That's why I'm always also reluctant when asked who are the people that we should be reading, who are what names can we associate with this approach. I always step back because it's not about people. It's about the ideas, and the ideas are inevitably going to come piecemeal from many thinkers, be refined, exchanged, accumulated, improved, and it's a direction that I hope the culture goes in. It is not trying to anoint some new guru as the embodiment of this movement. The other thing that I think we have to be very suspicious of is the ever-present force of demonizing the younger generation and the direction in which culture and society are going. There are always commentators who think that the kids today are dumbing down culture and taking human values with them. This is often directed at anything having to do with the web, as if the difference between being printed on dead trees versus being pixels on a screen is going to profoundly influence the content of ideas. There is inevitably a attitude that young people suck, that they are illiterate and unreflective and unthoughtful and so on, ignoring the fact that every generation had that said about them by the older generation, and somehow civilization persists. These are habits that, in fact, I think psychology can remind us that we as a species are prone to them, that when we comment on the direction that intellectual life is going, we should discount our own prejudices, our own natural inclination to say, I and my tribe are entitled to weigh in on profound issues, but members of some other guild or tribe or clique are not. And my generation is the embodiment of wisdom and experience, and the younger generation are uncouth, illiterate, unwashed, and uncivilized. Knowing from our own psychology that we're all prone to that gives us the distance to discount those flaws and to get a better appreciation of what direction the culture is going and what direction it ought to go in. There's no conflict between the sciences and humanities, or at least there shouldn't be. It shouldn't be framed as a turf battle as to who gets to speak about what matters. What matters are the ideas, and we should try to get the deepest, richest, best informed understanding of the human condition from ideas, regardless of what people or what discipline originates them.